At Sierra, discover great deals on top brand workout gear, like high-quality bikes, which might lead to another discovery. Getting back on the saddle isn't always comfortable. Good news is Sierra has massage guns. And chafe wipes, too. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
Birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, whatever the occasion, it just got a little more personal with meaningful photo gifts from Shutterfly. Add a silly photo to a gold-rimmed mug for your bestie. Put your sweet puppy on a cozy fleece blanket for your teen. Gift your husband a desktop plaque featuring all the kids. Enjoy 40% off orders over $29 with code POD40 at Shutterfly.com and make something that means something.
You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone, everywhere.
Welcome to Texas History Lessons. I'm Michael, and in this episode we're going to continue looking at Bride Neill Taylor's look at the foundation of the Texas State Historical Association, and I might just piece the two together, so for those that want to listen to it completely, it'll be just available as one piece. The last episode ended with the troubles that were faced by the attempt to start it by certain old guard members like Rip Ford, who was an aged man at the time, and how he potentially could have been a problem for the group because he didn't like certain things about women being involved and the names used for women members. And Dr. Garrison, being more forward-looking, saw the sign of the times and that women were going to take their place someday. And it's interesting because you have to also remember there were no black members at that time. And you can just imagine what kind of problems would have been faced had Dr. Garrison invited some black young historians to be part of the foundation of the group. What kind of a uproar would have been raised by Owen Roberts, who had been the leader of the secessionist convention, and Colonel Ford, who had been a proud Confederate as well. And that was the time period we were living in. We were living in the time period of the lost cause history. And, you know, they weren't focusing on Texas as a Southwest or Western state. Texas was still looked on as a Southern state. And you'll get a part of that here in this next section. So things were different back then, and people looked at things differently, and looking at articles like this and at some of the early histories show how differently they perceived their past to be. They thought they were advanced at this point, and they had a long ways to go, just like we still do, but we have come a long ways from even this point in time. But let's continue with finishing Bride Neill Taylor's memory of the foundation of the association. And if you remember, she had just talked about how Colonel Ford had made his displeasure known concerning lady members being just referred to as members, and they could be known as fellows if they were recognized as fellows instead of being lady fellows, and that he had stormed out. But he had finally, after being consulted again, he had agreed to lend his support because he understood the importance of preserving the history. And she had just mentioned at the very end of the last episode that Colonel Ford did indeed not have long in this world. And 8 months and a day after the first meeting, he had died, and the first volume of the quarterly that was someday known as the Southwestern Historical Quarterly in January 1898 had carried his obituary. And then she continues by saying the list of officers for the first year of the association was as follows: President Orrin M. Roberts, Vice Presidents Dudley G. Wooten, Guy M. Bryan, William Corner, Mrs. Julia Lee Sinks, Corresponding Secretary and Treasurer Lester G. Bugby, Recording Secretary and Librarian George P. Garrison, Executive Counsel Orrin M. Roberts, Dudley G. Wooten, Guy M. Bryan, William Corner, Mrs. Julia Lee Sinks, George P. Garrison, Eugene Diggs, Z.T. Fulmore, C.W. Raines, F.R. Lubbock, Mrs. D.F. Arthur, R.C. Burleson, M.M. Kinney, R.L. Batts, Mrs. Bride Neill Taylor. As I look back now over the history of our association, I think the most important thing provided for in the beginning was the immediate establishment of the quarterly. I need not dwell on the fact that it became the instrument by which was laid the foundation of all that the association has done for the development of our history. Everyone here must realize that this is so. But again, in our ignorance then of what it was to be and what it was to do, we were typical of our time. I can do no better than read from this same letter of Colonel Ford's from which I have already quoted to show just where we of Texas, outside of very few scholars, stood at that time. The proper history of Texas is yet unpublished. The men who enacted the great deeds, rendering the Lone Star Republic famous, have generally died without writing what stirred the heroic people and helped strengthen their resolution to resist tyranny. R.M. Williamson was an outspoken advocate of free government. He did more than any one man to nerve our people to strike for liberty. He has been gathered to his fathers, and where are the evidences of his wonderful exertions? They are almost lost to the world. General Thomas J. Rusk, brave, eloquent, and fearless, our Secretary of War when the Revolution was at its most fearful height, after the Alamo and Goliad and their defenders had fallen, after the mistaken members of the consultation had illegally attempted to turn Governor Smith out of office and to invade Mexico. Where is the historian who lived in those days of trouble and danger? Colonel Frank Johnson wrote a history of Texas. He was an officer in the Texas Army and was defeated at San Patricio. His work has never seen the light and perhaps never will. General Rusk was at the Battle of San Jacinto. He made an official report to President Burnett and left no individual private account of that wonderful contest. General Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, wrote a great deal. Up to the present time, no one has assumed the responsibility to edit and publish his papers and his life. Who can tell the career of Richard Ellis, the president of the Convention of 1836? How little is known of the members of that memorable and distinguished body of men? Who has written a comprehensive life of Travis, or of Bowie, and the heroes of the Alamo? What has been done to revive a correct memory of David G. Burnett, of General Edward Burleson? The Texans proved themselves good soldiers. If we look at their utter neglect to record what they have done in war and in the matter of legislation, we must conclude they were not willing writers. You see, I have allowed a subject to run away with me. I shall make no apology. If you get tired, burn the sheets. In the archives of the university, you will find manuscript memoirs by this devoted old pioneer giving proof positive that he took what he said in this letter seriously and did his best to save himself from falling under the reproach which he felt was due to those others. One more illustration of how we saw things in the first year of our association, and I am done with this phase of my subject. We were gathered at a meeting of the Executive Council in a room on the second floor of the main building of the university, with President Roberts in the chair. Secretary Garrison was reading a list of names of persons to be recommended for election as fellows. He came to the name of David F. Houston. The venerable chairman pricked up his ears. "Wait a minute, Dr. Garrison," he interrupted. "Isn't that the young man who had his book investigated by the last legislature on account of something in it against the principles of the Confederacy?" "Yes, Governor," answered Dr. Garrison, "but the committee found that the objectionable paragraphs were quoted from Madison, and the investigation was dropped." A motion to recommend the list of names as offered by the secretary was made. The chairman shook his head doubtingly. "I think," he said, "that it would be better for us to go slow on that name." Judge Fulmore and 2 or 3 others spoke in favor of including Dr. Houston's name in the list to be recommended, giving various facts in his life which they believed were sufficient proof of his political orthodoxy. The feeling in favor of the motion was so plainly compelling that the chairman, although looking very anxious and troubled, finally put it to a vote and was carried unanimously. As he announced the result, the old man shook his head warningly. "I can't help questioning the wisdom of this action at this time," he said. "We should have done better if we had waited a little longer until the affair in the legislature was forgotten. We don't want to hurt the association in the minds of the people. So far as I myself am concerned, I have nothing whatever against the young man, and I hope he will live the thing down. Now, I must take the precaution of seeing that I make plain the primary meaning of this incident. Governor Roberts stands out as one of the most experienced political leaders in the whole history of Texas, familiar as few, if any, others have ever been with the feeling of the people. As pioneer and district attorney in the days of the Republic, as district judge, chief justice of the Supreme Court in the state, as commander of the Houston 11th Infantry in the Confederacy, as governor, and finally, in these last days, as professor of law in the university, he had come into contact with the mind of the masses as probably no other man has ever had the opportunity of doing in Texas. Wise, prudent, far-seeing, well, he realized that spring afternoon in 1898 that the slightest hint going out over the state that our infant association was lax in its devotion to the traditions which enshrined the lost cause in their hearts as something inexpressibly sacred would not be reasoned about by our people. It would simply be felt, and the association would suffer as the victim of their resentment. As president of the State Historical Association, he was taking thought first of all for its welfare. Consideration for individuals, no matter how worthy, did not concern him. Fortunately, however, our action, when it was ratified by the Assembly at the annual meeting, created no excitement, and the forebodings of Governor Roberts came to naught. He, however, was not there to see. He died on May 19th, very shortly after this meeting of the Executive Council, and the Vice President, Dudley G. Wooten, as presiding officer, delivered a fitting eulogy in his memory. The story of the association during its next few years is that of most newly established organizations, which make their appeal especially to the intellectual. A struggle to increase the membership, a struggle to secure funds, a struggle to carry out the projects offered to its consideration in the face of insufficient resources, a struggle to get its patriotic message over to the people, the whole people. Somehow the work went forward. It never seemed to slip backward. Its progress was certainly slow, but never uncertain. The main difficulty was in the strain for funds. Money came in so slowly, I don't know where it came from. But I do know that not money but service given without price on the part of, first of all, Dr. Garrison, and then of a little group of young disciples whom he had in training in the School of History, was what actually kept the association going forward. The first and most important undertaking was to establish a magazine to make us known. On this, the entire efforts of the active workers at the head of the organization were concentrated. It was called the Quarterly of the Texas State Historical Association. In connection with the Quarterly, there comes to mind another happening which has a very pertinent value for us now, illustrating as it does what we owe to its founder for the high degree of honor in which it is held everywhere in the field of historical scholarship. Like the others, this anecdote is entirely personal, for I take it that what you especially wish to receive from me this evening is the account of such intimate facts of our beginnings as will help to transport you back to that time and help you to some sort of a sense of its actuality. At the first annual meeting, a publication committee had been chosen, and I was greatly surprised and flattered to find my name among those of the four selected. But the pleasure I felt was soon dashed by the discovery, as time went on, that my function in this connection was to be something very different from what I had at first expected. My name on the cover of the Quarterly as one of the publication committee gave notice to the public that I had some part in the preparation of it, at least so I thought. But in reality, until it came to me in the mail, I knew no more of what was inside the covers than any unofficial reader. And as I anxiously studied the makeup of each number, I began to understand that I had nothing to contribute. The earliest numbers were filled with articles from those who had had actual experience of the events they recorded, or with scholarly studies from the pens of the later generation of writers then in training for work as professional historians. I was not old enough to have had any part in those earliest events, and what I knew from hearsay was too inexact and haphazard to deserve the dignity of publication in a journal such as the association aimed to offer to the people of Texas. So I began to feel that my name on the cover of the magazine was a wholly unmerited honor, an embarrassment from which I ought to relieve the editor. I mentioned this to him after a time, assuring him that far from being offended, I should be gratified at having my name dropped, so as to make a vacancy for someone who could be of real use. "No," said Dr. Garrison with unusual positiveness. "I want to keep your name just where it is." "But," I protested, "I give no service. There is none that I can give. I am a mere figurehead." He smiled. "You give the kind of service I need. If you made a vacancy, I would most likely have someone forced on me in your place who would insist on giving service without being capable of giving what I want." And then he went on to tell me something of his embarrassments in warding off advice, criticisms, contributions, and offers of various other kinds of help from persons often very influential who had no conception of the requirements of such a magazine. To have, therefore, someone on the committee who, not knowing, knew that she did not know, and left him to pursue his own plans unmolested by advice, was a very comforting sort of help. The conversation revealed to me his idea of the character he planned to impress on our publication, and gave me an appreciation of his tact and resolution in providing such precautions as he thought necessary to make sure that he was going to succeed. I was one of those precautions, and after his explanation I was content to remain in the position assigned to me as a silent partner in the good work. Does not this episode, simple and amusing though it seems to be, show you how much we owe to the founder of the Quarterly for the honorable place it today enjoys in the libraries of the world? And let us bear in mind that it was no foregone conclusion that it should reach such a position. With a different influence behind it, it might not have done so, or at least not until a much later period, for journals of similar associations, born under auspices of another sort, have failed to reach any such position of dignity. Initial difficulties such as this, and others that I have mentioned, faded away gradually as Dr. Garrison's training in the Department of History developed those disciples, already referred to, who were to inherit his spirit. Any one who has access to the unbound copies of the earliest numbers of the Quarterly will find the front cover a document of interest indicating who those first helpers were and giving some facts not carried over to the bound volumes. First among those now historic names comes that of Lester G. Bugbee, the corresponding secretary and treasurer. In any study of the first years of the association, two names stand out together: Garrison and Bugbee. Dr. Garrison was more than founder. He was a true father to the organization. He it was who planned, inspired, and governed the course of the association's infant development, and so fixed in it that admirable character which we inherit today. But he, overloaded as he was with his regular duties as head of the Department of History, would have found himself bitterly handicapped in his efforts without the intelligent, self-sacrificing helpers so fortunately provided. Bugbee did the drudgery which made the directing force effective. Together, the two were like a well-matched team, pulling ahead with a single mind. The younger man, first as student and then as instructor in history, had imbibed to the full the spirit of the older, and the main business of the association under these circumstances went straight ahead, straight but slowly and painfully. Keeping up the Quarterly was the main business. It was like the house that Jack built. In the spare time of the long term, and all of the time in the summer vacations, the faithful secretary-treasurer went at his task systematically, advertising the aims and needs of the organization in order to get members, in order to get money, in order to get out the Quarterly. The Quarterly never failed to come out, but sometimes Dr. Garrison had to help out finances from his own pocket, and of course the secretary-treasurer's services had to be a gift. In addition to such pressing duties as these, he also took part in editing, besides contributing some of the best materials which went into its makeup. To those of us who know all of this, those early numbers have a deep human interest. After 4 years of such labors, we lost his services. In 1901, he was obliged to ask for a year's leave of absence from the university on account of failing health. And the following year, he died, a victim of tuberculosis. His loss was a hard blow to the association, as well to the Department of History in the university and to the field of Texas historical writing, where he was making his mark. My own personal knowledge of him was slight, though full of admiration, but from one of his most devoted followers, Dr. Barker, I have gotten a more intimate idea of him, given in few words but full of light and life. Bugby, Dr. Barker once told me, was a great man in my development, not forgetting, of course, the debt we all owe to Dr. Garrison. It was Bugby who came into closer and more informal contact with the students, and he was a very delightful person, very stimulating. Many of the students hung on his every word. He was a Finnish scholar, and what he published set before us models of the best historical writing. He had the gift of sensing the perspective of his subject, and of thus throwing his article into a setting which put it in touch with the time. The notice of his death was carried in the Quarterly of July 1902, and on the cover of the same number appeared the name of his successor, Eugene C. Barker. 2 years later, on the cover of the April 1904 number emerges the name of another young recruit, H.E. Bolton, appointed with Barker to a position which shows a new departure in the management of the magazine, that of associate editors. This was the beginning of the end of the publication committee, whose names shortly afterward disappeared from the cover, superseded by those of the associate editors. Then, in 1906, comes another change, when the name of Eugene C. Barker is replaced by that of Charles W. Ramsdell, third in the office of Secretary-Treasurer, and after 22 years still giving himself to the work in the same spirit as that of his two predecessors. In 1910, in the April number, the name of Bolton disappears from the cover as associate editor, and there comes out that of his two predecessors. In 1910, in the April number, the name of Bolton disappears from the cover as associate editor, and there comes out that of another valuable new recruit, E.W. Winkler. Then finally, the October 1910 number noted a change which marks the end of our first epoch. The place occupied from the beginning by the name of Dr. Garrison as editor-in-chief is blank. He died in July, cut down, as I've always believed, by overwork, the last straw of which was the editing of the Texas Diplomatic Correspondence. In a talk I had with him a few weeks before his death, and the last time I ever saw him, he spoke of his extreme weariness, and said that he was hoping that as soon as the last touch had been put to this work, he might find a chance to rest and recuperate, for, he went on to say, the labor of it, added to his other duties, had become a load almost insupportable. Shortly afterward, we heard of his illness. On his deathbed, he read the proofs of the final installment of that fatal diplomatic correspondence for the July Quarterly, superintended, as usual, the final preparations for the issuance of that number, and then, a few days later, was gone, cut down in his prime, and literally dying in harness, what we might call the harness of the cause of the history of Texas. The July Quarterly was the last number to carry his name on its cover. 3 succeeding numbers came out with that sad blank, after which it was filled by the name of one of the associate editors, Dr. Barker. After Dr. Garrison's death, I ceased to be in close touch with the progress of association affairs, and had no longer an intimate knowledge of what was going on. The cover and inside pages of the Quarterly show from time to time new names blossoming out into our record, but as what I know of them did not come to me through personal experience, and is therefore secondhand information rather than what I have been trying to give you this evening as firsthand, I leave the story of service connected with those names to those who come after me. But though I thus in 1910 ceased to be of the inner circle, and may not offer further the information from that point of view, I have nevertheless a later estimate of the work to give, which, like all that I have so far offered, is from personal experience. For after several years of separation from intimate knowledge of the course of association events, I have come again into closer relation to it from an entirely different angle, that of one observing from the outside instead of from the inside, of one who is a beneficiary of its activities instead of a contributor to them. And in that position, I get a demonstration of the value of what has been accomplished during those 31 years of our existence, possible to but a few. In making investigations into the earliest history of Austin and the surrounding region of Central Texas, I am filled with wonder at the immense wealth of material now accumulated in the Archives Department of the university. and even more so at the availability of it all. And here again, personal experience helps to guide my estimate, for as a member of one of the first women's clubs in our state to turn its attention to the study of Texas history, I am able to contrast the paucity of historical material to be found 35 years ago with what we find now, and also to compare the facility with which it can now be located, and examined with the difficulties of such a task then. How laborious, how discouraging it was to try to prepare a club paper on almost any phase of our history in 1897. How enjoyable, how comparatively easy in 1928. One's appreciation and thankfulness for this is measured only by the length and depth of one's experience. You investigators of this later generation take it, most likely, as a matter of course. I dwell on it in order to give you the happy understanding of your good fortune and having to do your work now instead of then. Such an achievement in so short a space of time, with such limited resources, has not come about as a matter of course either. Very earnestly do I wish to leave in your mind some realization of what we owe to that little group who began this work with such devotion and wisdom, and to those successors who have carried it on to this day. In addition to his fitness for the work, the founder, unlike many another, had the foresight to begin at once to develop fit disciples who could carry on after him. The story told this evening would be very different but for that. With the help of those followers, he set going forces which were from year to year to provide the answer to those anxious questions which Colonel Ford put into that letter which I have read to you about saving for the future generations suitable accounts of, quote, the men who enacted great deeds, tendering the Lone Star Republic famous. His forebodings have been most happily met. The rich collections of Austin, Lamar, Erath, and Burnett papers, not to mention those of others hardly less important, are now safely collected and preserved, and the fame of those early heroes and statesmen which he so pathetically feared might be ignored has been taken care of for all time. Austin, for whom he was so particularly concerned, has already been set in the splendid galaxy of American state builders by the brilliant and profound work of one of our founder's most faithful disciples, Dr. E.C. Barker. Also, the different members of the faculty of the School of History and the heads of various library collections are constantly taking measures to see that justice is done to all. What a big task to be accomplished in the course of one generation. In examining the reason for it, we shall see that it had been owing not alone to the devotion and intelligence of those whom I have named and to their co-workers, whose cooperation has taken place at a date later than that with which my own experience coincides, nor yet to the fine spirit they have inherited, but quite as much to the continuity of that spirit and to its unanimity. For without that, there would have been setbacks, hindrances, delays. So far as I know, there have been none of consequence. There has always been that strong pull forward, which has also been a pull all together. The effect is before us. I have aimed this evening to do what I could to recreate the atmosphere of the era of the generation preceding that of today. To that end, I have confined myself so closely to personal experiences. The incidents in which I participated, though so amusing to you here this evening in the telling, were by no means trivial. I hold them to have been of serious importance. There is so much that is typical of the time in them that I could hardly ask for more illuminating illustrations of what I wish to get before you. The attitude of mind which characterized the men and women of that day has been so completely transformed that it amounts to a mental revolution. I know of no way in which the spirit of that time can be brought home to you, except by simply telling you in this informal way the actual happenings which surrounded the beginnings of our association. And that's where Bride Neill Taylor ended her article, The Beginnings of the State Historical Association, that was published in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, Volume 33, Number 1, in 1929. And she really did a good job of capturing the early time and the struggles they faced, and how important a role Dr. Garrison, the academic historian that was head of the Department of History at University of Texas, played in the creation and shaping of the association and the quarterly, because he was focused on being devoted to the historical method and not just being a fan club of early Texas history. And today we still benefit from the work that they did. The many publications that the Texas State Historical Association has published over the years, the Handbook of Texas, which now is available as the Handbook of Texas Online, the great variety of subject matters that have been covered and published by the association are really a treasure house. Pretty much unknown in almost any other state to such a degree. The papers of Lamar and Austin were published in bound volumes and are searchable now online. And the memoirs of Colonel Ford that were mentioned earlier that were just sitting in the archive in 1928 were preserved in the archives and are now available. They were put into book form and edited by historian Stephen B. Oates later on. And there are many examples of this kind of thing happening because of the efforts of these early people trying to preserve the history of Texas. Another interesting point that came up in Bride Neill Taylor's speech was the incident concerning David F. Houston. He had received his master's degree from Harvard in 1892, and he had recently accepted a position as an adjunct professor at the University of Texas in 1894, and he just published a critical study of nullification in South Carolina in 1896. And this work had been researched while he was at Harvard under the guidance of the historian Albert Bushnell Hart, and it established his reputation as a scholar. But it also, as it's made apparent in the article, it also raised the hackles of lost cause loving Texans. And, just a brief scan of it, Houston recognized that Southern dedication to preserving the institution of slavery was the contributing factor to the secession crisis and the Civil War. And it's available online. You can find it easily. And anyhow, it shows how something like that, a piece of scholarship that might have in any way shown the Confederacy in a negative light, we've come a long ways from that time period. And he went on to be a member of the association because he was allowed in, but he also went on to become a respected businessman and was a Democrat, and he served under President Woodrow Wilson as the 5th Secretary of Agriculture and the 48th United States Secretary of the Treasury. So he went on to have bigger and greater things after being at UT and being a part of the Texas State Historical Association. And that's another just interesting aspect. And the fact that the dedication to the role as a Confederate state as being what they were focused on, making sure to be preserved, is an interesting snippet that's available in looking at this old speech given in the 1920s. And one more thing is, if you get a chance, the Texas myth and mystique was still being formed, and at that point, that was the focus. The shift to make heroes of the cowboys and cattlemen was going to come a little bit later. At that time, the heroes were the founders of the Republic and the Indian fighters and the ones that had served the Confederacy.
We're so done with New Year, New You. This year, it's more you on Bumble. More of you shamelessly sending playlists, especially that one filled with show tunes. More of you finding Geminis because you know you always like them. More of you dating with intention because you know what you want. And you know what? We love that for you. Someone else will too. Be more you this year and find them on Bumble.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does without me lifting a finger, so I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit, 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
So there we go. That's going to do it. That's going to put an end to this episode. And thanks for listening. Theme music is by Derek McClendon. Check his music out when you get a chance. I'll be back soon with another episode of Texas History Lessons. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Be kind. Adios.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.